Today we have Tara Teng with us. And Tara, I'm so excited to chat a little bit more about your brand new book. Tara, you do so many cool things in the world. You are an embodiment coach and a somatic practitioner. And I'll just
Mm.
say, you have one of the coolest stories just in general. Like, you don't dive so much into it, like in
Mm.
terms of like all of the other things that you got going on in your life. But like just a little bit ago, I ended up just, searching your name and then realized, oh, there's a whole Wikipedia page about your story and who you are, and it's just amazing. So, anyway, you are just doing really, really cool things in the world. But I want to know from your perspective,
Mm.
who is Tara Teng to Tara Teng?
Oh man, such a good question. I think I more than anything, like I am rediscovering new parts of myself all the time. So you
Mm-hmm.
asked me that question today, it will be different probably even
I'm
tomorrow.
sure.
And I love that. Like I have so much curiosity for who I am, for how my journey is unfolding. The person that I am today is not at all the person that I was when that Wikipedia
Mm-hmm.
page was written,
Right.
for example, or who I was even 2 years ago. And I love that. I am perpetually curious. I am just wanting to taste and experience all that life is. I want to embrace the full spectrum of my humanity and my
Mm-hmm.
human experience, and welcome back all of these pieces of myself. So I think that that's the biggest part of who I am, is perpetually curious and hungry for more all the time.
I love that. I love that. Well, one of those things that you have done in your life is you are now an author of an incredible book called Your Body is a Revolution. It just was released
Yay!
recently. The subtitle is great too. It's healing our relationships with our bodies, each other, and the earth. Unbelievable book. It's so
Mhm.
great. I'm really excited to chat more about it. But
Thank you.
before we talk like about kind of like the contents of the book, I'm really interested
Yeah.
in just what you learned about not only yourself, but just what you learned in the book writing
Mm.
process. And so, obviously, there's like some
Mhm.
theology in here. Obviously, there's a lot of your story that's in here. There's a lot of different things about
Mhm.
like colonization that's in here, right? There's a lot of different pieces that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Can you talk about like something that you learned, maybe like factually or theologically
Mm.
or historically or so, but something along those lines? Is there anything that you learned as you were writing the book that you're like, wait, I had no idea about that before. I have to include that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much. I think one of the things that I learned through the research process of it, because it's looking at not just my relationship with my body. I get so freaking vulnerable in this book, and I share things
Mm-hmm.
that I hadn't ever before. Um, but but really looking at, like, historically, collectively, where have we come on our journeys with our bodies? Our bodies have been not only just criticized, but they've been criminalized in different places
Mm-hmm.
for many different reasons. And one of the things that I hadn't been familiar with before was the ugly laws in the United States, and the way that
Mm-hmm.
if you were disabled or categorized as disformed in your body in any way, that you couldn't take up space publicly. Public
Mm.
parks, you couldn't sit in there. You couldn't just you had to be hidden, right? So when we think of marginalizations of bodies, when we think about body-based oppression, these are people that were literally pushed into the margins, isolated, and criminalized if they took up space publicly. And so every injustice in the world I have found, and if you read that Wikipedia page, you saw that I spent a lot of time working on human rights activist stuff. I worked
Mm-hmm.
in parliament, worked from a legislative perspective for many years. All of these things of social justice, I found that every injustice in the world begins with the body. And that
Mm.
was one of my biggest motivations of writing this book. Is my relationship with my body came to, I felt like I could finally be embodied myself. Um, and this was a piece that was just missing, was somatics and social justice and spirituality all brought together. And things like the ugly laws, my research brought me there, and I didn't know it went that deep. So when we're talking about these stigmas, when we're talking about even the idealized bodies, that so many of us have this in our heads, right? Like, this is where a lot of these ideas come from. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we're pushing back and we're wanting to see change, these are real systemic things that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. I love that you begin with saying that every injustice begins with the body. I literally,
Yeah.
pretty much almost word for word, wrote that in my thesis. I wrote my thesis last year about
Mm.
embodiment, and one of the things that I kind of proposed in it is, we often talk about like injustice or oppression, like
Yeah.
at a systematic or a systemic level
Yeah.
or a personal level. But I also think that there is like this embodied component to injustice,
Mm.
to oppression as well.
There
And
is.
we need to think about
Yeah.
injustice and oppression in that way as well. So I really love that you bring that
Yeah.
up right away.
Yeah, and it's such a, like, visceral response in our bodies too when we do come across that oppression or that
Mm-hmm.
injustice. If we've ever felt othered, our bodies feel it, right? We get that
Mm-hmm.
whole jolt that comes right up through our nervous system. Anytime that we've been pushed aside, excluded by something, we can see it even with the way just like kids interact on the playground, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
very visceral experience. It's a very embodied experience. So, of course, when we're looking at these things systemically, we also look at the way that it impacts the relationships we have with
Mm-hmm.
our bodies and each other.
Mm-hmm. So that's something that you kind of learned factually around. You mentioned like the ugly laws and some of those
Yeah.
injustices regarding the body. What was something that you learned about yourself as you wrote the book? Maybe there was something
Oh,
as you were writing the book where you're like, "Wow, I had no idea that I had that in me." But yeah, was there something that you learned about yourself as you wrote the book that you didn't know about yourself before?
I changed so dramatically through this process of researching, writing, every single draft and revision that I did. I mean, I started like when I wrote the proposal and put it out there that this was something that I was thinking about, like I was very firmly like I'm a progressive Christian and I still identify as a Christian and I don't today. I identify as
Mm.
ex-evangelical now. So
Mhm.
my faith journey dramatically changed. I started the
Mm.
process like early 2020, pandemic happened, everything that we walked through collectively through the pandemic. I don't think any single person is like everyone has been changed. Nobody is the same as when we started the pandemic together, right? And so I changed dramatically through that. Part of that was what I saw collectively as we all experienced. Part of it was my own research, even as I was writing the books. But it really made me grapple and wrestle with some of the stuff that had already kind of been shifting within me. And that was one thing that dramatically changed within me as a result.
That's incredible. I don't This might be one of the first times I've interviewed somebody who mentions that as the thing that they learned about themselves, that they're like, "You know what? I'm no
Really?
longer
Yeah.
Christian." And I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's great.
Yeah, I did not expect that, and I think that
It's interesting.
that's one of the things that when I think of, like, all the former versions of myself that exist, right? Because the way that I see it is with nervous system work, I am the age I am today and simultaneously every other age I have been so far in my life to date because my body remembers and my nervous system holds all of the memories of every experience that I have. So something from when I was 6 years old may pop up triggered in my nervous system at any point in time, right? It's like she still exists somewhere within me. And so it gives me so much compassion for all of those places I've been. And also, I think there's parts of myself that would be shocked that I am where I am today.
Mhm.
My faith was very, very dear to me for a really long time. And it's something that I think a younger version of myself never would have ever dreamed that I would walk away from. But at the same time, my core values and my ethics have remained the same.
Mm. Mhm.
And I really think that for me, the thing that actually made me shift away from the institution of Christianity was Jesus. And the fact that,
Mm.
I love Jesus's teachings of nonviolence. I love how embodied Jesus was. I love how with the people and how radical Jesus was to these hierarchies and establishments that were built on power and access. And I don't see Jesus standing for those things. So I left.
Mm. Mm. I love that.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more, or actually, before we dive into some of the contents of the book, one of the things that I often run into when I'm having conversations about embodiment
Mm,
is it seems like a lot of people have different understandings of what it means to be embodied or what they mean
sure.
by embodiment. So, when you're talking about embodiment, when you're talking about being
Mhm.
embodied in this book, what do you mean by that?
Oh, such a good question. And you're right. I feel like everyone has a different definition for it. And I think that's
Mhm.
because everyone has a different relationship with their bodies.
Mhm.
And so for me, embodiment is just the lived experience of actually living in your body, present in your body. It's a continual practice and it's an in the moment thing. And I know it sounds so simple, So, like, well, everybody is in our bodies all the time, aren't we? But
Mhm.
really,
Mhm.
so much of us live in our heads all the time. We're using our bodies just to get from point A to point B. I mean, to the point that we actually say things like, "Oh, it's our body's just a meat suit," or it's mind over matter. How often have we heard somebody say, "Oh, mind over matter"? Well, that's disembodied, right?
Mhm.
And so for me, embodiment is the practice of realizing that my body is the primary experience of how I navigate the world. She is my greatest ally. She is a source of wisdom, of intuition, of strength, and anything that disassociates me from my body usually has a reason in which they're trying to do that.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, the reason why I ask is, again,
Mm,
like, I'm coming off of a year of doing my thesis about embodiment,
yeah,
and one of the things that
I
I
would
would
love
kind
to
of get.
read.
Oh, I will gladly send it to you. But yeah, one of
Amazing.
the things that I get a little maybe like annoyed or frustrated about like the embodiment
Mm,
conversation is a lot of times what it means for like the way a lot of people are using the word embodiment or using the word embodied
mm,
is they're just meaning like just do something like physically, like what they mean,
right.
like do yoga or whatever,
Sure.
like get go
Yeah.
go outside and take a walk or whatever. But they what they're
Yeah.
meaning is something like where it's like a physical activity that you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's all well and great, but I'm more
Yeah.
curious about like what is actually happening physiologically in our bodies when we do these sorts of
Totally.
things. Like, you bring up Resma McKennon's work around like
Yeah.
epigenetics and the
Yep.
like the actual like physiology that changes when people experience like racial
Mhm.
trauma, for example. Those
Mhm.
are to me the more interesting things about embodiment than like the
Totally.
actual like just do this thing physically or whatever. So anyway,
Totally.
that's part of the
Yes.
reason why I was really curious about how you're using embodiment and throughout
And
this
I
book.
love that you're saying that because I noticed the same thing too. And so maybe a year and a half to 2 years ago, I was pondering the same things in my online community on Instagram. And I had somebody reach out to me and we started a conversation. They have a disability, and we were talking about, well, what does that look like if you're living in a body that is disabled,
Mm,
right? Or
mhm,
that has different abilities, different challenges, different chronic illnesses, maybe. And one of the things that I feel really strongly about, and I included a whole chapter in my book on, was that if we are doing embodiment or presenting embodiment in a way that is ableist, we're doing it wrong,
mm, mhm,
because it's not about like, look at all the amazing things that my body can do, and like, yes, I want to celebrate that, and I feel very present in my body when I'm dancing, for example, right? But if that is the definition of embodiment, it's incomplete, it's
mhm,
inaccurate, it's ableist, it's not correct. And
mhm,
so how can you be embodied even if you cannot leave your bed? You can still have a deeper relationship with your body, even with all the frustrations or the grief or the pain or the agony that might exist there presently. It is important to acknowledge that as well. And you can be just as embodied as somebody who's like, look at how I can dance, and look at the way
mhm,
that I can climb rocks and mountains and do these amazing feats of strength. You can still be just as present in your body and just as embodied, even with a chronic condition. I have a chronic condition as well, and so this chapter on embodiment and disability justice is really, really close to my heart as well.
mhm,
And for the very reasons that you just mentioned.
mhm, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the very beginning of the book, and I love the way you
Mm,
start it, where you talk about some of the bad theology that has fractured
yeah.
our relationships with our bodies. So, can you talk about what some of this bad theology is and why it warps or
Mm,
fractures our relationship with our bodies?
yeah. I mean, oh, there's so much. I grew up as a pastor's kid. I grew up like deep in like small town conservative evangelical culture. And so the
Mhm,
things that I was raised hearing was like, you are desperately wicked. You can't trust your body. It's like this slippery slope down to hell.
mhm,
Purity culture is, a lot of people are talking about the purity movement now, which came to its height in the 90s, 2000s, when many of us
mhm,
were in our adolescence, that said things like true love waits and save sex for marriage. And not only was it abstinence only education, but there was this policed and enforced modesty culture that
mhm,
we really didn't get to choose or opt in or opt out of. It was very much enforced. And so it taught us that our bodies are bad. It taught us that our bodies are something that we have to distrust. And really, in order to survive in these really high control spaces, we had to distance ourselves from our bodies because that was what was decided was pure, good, holy. And we would be isolated if we had this connection with our bodies and definitely with our sexuality, that anybody else deemed as bad. And it was a very, for me in my experience, growing up in a small town in a Baptist church, like it was very white dominated as well. So I also didn't see a lot of other racialized bodies. I didn't see a lot of mixed race bodies like myself, being biracial, and so there was a lot of very complicated experiences there because representation also tells us what is good or right or idealized or how we ought to aspire to be, right? And
Mhm.
so it was sometimes the theology that was said, but just as harmful was the theology that was unsaid,
Mm.
but very much normalized.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I also grew up in conservative evangelicalism in the
Mhm.
2000s, and yeah, there very
Yeah.
much is this emphasis that, the flesh is sinful, the
Yeah.
flesh is evil, and, yeah, you really begin to distrust your body, and like we've talked about, it fractures that relationship with our
It
bodies,
does.
and,
It's
yeah.
traumatic.
Yeah, and even for my own personal story, like part of the reason why I ended up leaving evangelicalism was, or actually
Mhm.
really the main reason, or at least the beginning of it, was because I started to feel in my body, I started to feel this disconnect between what I was taught with purity culture and what I was actually experiencing in my body
Yeah.
as a teenager. And I was
Yeah.
like, this doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't work for me anymore. And that was like the
Yeah.
first little kind of slippery, it was the first part of that slippery slope that ended up changing everything for me. But yeah, it
Yeah.
all really came down to my body started to experience this
Mm.
disconnect with what I was being taught theologically.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that was the thing that was interesting for me as well too. Looking back, now that I know the way that my body communicates to me through sensations in my nervous system, through, when we have that feeling that we often reference of like, that like feeling in your gut, right? Where you drop into your gut or you feel like your stomach's all twisted and in knots, noticing the way that my body would hold on to tension when I was in these like very high control religion, conservative evangelical spaces. My body was telling me something was off the whole
Mhm.
entire time, but I had been taught to distrust my body. So I didn't know how to pick up on the signals. And then everybody that I was taught to submit to obey, the authorities over me, whether that be my parents, my Sunday school teachers, youth pastors, church pastors, all of these people who are like, these are the people who have the answers and they are the ones that you need to listen to. Don't trust yourself, listen to these people. I mean, looking back, not only was my body screaming from the inside the whole time, my whole tension in my body, the chronic stress, my nervous system, being all out of whack, but even physical symptoms. Like I used to have eczema all over my arms, all over my hands because of the weight of my of all of this bad theology that my body was screaming out under, saying like
Mm.
there's something off here. And as a child, not having the autonomy or the ability to question any of these things, and when I did question them, being completely dismissed, looking back, I can see how harmful it was and how abusive it was. But at the time, especially as a young person, I didn't know any differently.
Mhm. Mhm. It's really interesting you bring up the eczema part of your story.
Hmm.
I I find it so interesting the way that our bodies are able to navigate the abstract in our lives.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
abstract things about, like the idea that the idea that your flesh is sinful is an
Hmm.
abstract
Yeah,
idea. Yet
it is.
it gets mediated through our bodies, and our bodies because of that
Yeah,
react or respond to it. And
it
that to
does.
me is
Yeah.
super, super fascinating. It comes back to even
Hmm.
like Resma McKennon's work around racial
Yeah.
trauma and how that
Yeah.
gets the sort of symptoms or signs that racial
Yeah.
trauma is happening within a body. It's
Absolutely.
fascinating how
It
something
is.
like racism, this massive
Yeah.
abstract idea that obviously gets utilized by certain
Mm.
people, will then be able to be mediated through our bodies, and then our bodies respond
Yeah,
accordingly. And I just find that so fascinating that our bodies are able to
absolutely.
respond to abstract things like that. Anyway, I maybe you
Yeah.
have thoughts around that.
No, I think that that's absolutely 100% accurate. That's true in the research that I have done as well. And also the clients that I work with, I hear similar stories all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear a lot of people come to me that are reclaiming body liberation, or reclaiming their relationship with their bodies, undoing all of this toxic theology, and the impacts of things like patriarchy and colonization and white supremacy that is steeped into our culture. A lot of people are undoing the effects of purity culture, and so they come in to work with me. And so some of the things that I see, in addition to what I'm hearing you say, is I'm also seeing like higher rates of sexual, what we would classify as sexual dysfunction, but I
Mm-hmm.
really see that as like sexual trauma as a result of purity culture, because it is
Mm-hmm.
traumatic. I'm seeing a lot of things like vaginismus, higher rates of vaginismus that my clients are dealing with. So
Mm-hmm.
we often work in partnership with pelvic physiotherapists. And also my work in the past, before I started with somatics, was I worked as a birth doula. So seeing a lot of those same crossovers overlapping with the way that our bodies respond to things. And also seeing things, like panic attacks, anxiety all the time. I again remember growing up in like the 90s, 2000s, and there was so much like, like satanic panic in the 90s, 2000s, right? And like evangelicals just being terrified of everything. And then now you see so many people who are older who are deconstructing their Christianity, who are deconstructing purity culture, and seeing the way that, like, oh my gosh, my anxiety is tied into the fact that, like, as a child, like, the number one book was the Left Behind series,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
we were told that we were going to be like left behind because the world was going to end and all of these things were happening, and like I was constantly fearful and afraid. And so of course my body holds on to those things. Of course
Mm-hmm.
my body holds on to all the teachings of purity culture, and that I need to close up, and I need to like protect against sexual what is it, I can't remember the word right now, it's totally left me, but like, like arm yourself with the full armor of God against like sexual immorality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like of course now my body doesn't want to open up when I'm in a loving like partnership and I feel safe with this person, but my body, my nervous system is still holding on to the teachings of when I was like 11 years old.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Absolutely. It,
it's
it
wild.
it sort of connects to my next question, where in the middle of the book
Mm,
you talk about the ways that bodies are politicized and
yes,
oppressed. And I think
yes.
this brings up a really important point, that how we understand the body is not just something that is biological. Uh,
Mhm.
our bodies are also socially constructed, and therefore
Yeah,
they're politicized and then even
yeah,
oppressed. And
yes.
so, for example, there are people who have more melanin in their skin than
Mhm,
other people, but that doesn't
mhm.
mean that they're inherently inferior just because they have more
Totally.
melanin in their skin than others. But socially, the world has been socially constructed in such a way where
Yes.
that is the perception of people,
Yeah,
and that's how we're going to treat people who have more
yeah,
melanin in their skin than others, is by
yeah,
treating them as if they're inferior. And so, see how
yeah,
like there's a biological component in to our
yeah.
bodies, but then also we're socially
We
constructing a
politicized
world
it.
based on that
Yes,
biological component. And I find that really
yes.
interesting. So, can you talk about a little bit, just maybe some of your thoughts around like the ways that our
Mm,
bodies are also socially constructed along with the
mhm.
biological component that is involved with our bodies?
Yeah, I mean, you said it so perfectly, right? Like these are natural things that happen. Our bodies have different shades of skin tones, different shapes that they come in, all these different things. And this is why we say like also the every injustice begins with the body, right? Ageism,
Mm-hmm.
sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these different things, right? Racism, to all of them, they all come down to the differences of our body. Our body should be the great equalizer. We all live in a body. We all have a body from the moment we're born to the day that we die. There is no other way to experience our humanity. And yet we have chosen, instead of it being the thing that unites us, we've chosen for it to be the thing that has separated us, because patriarchy, colonization, white supremacy, these ideas that were used to build the institutions that we still see kicking around today, that's how they created this hierarchy of bodies and hierarchy of power, who had power, who did not, right? And
Mm.
so yes, there's a biological component of them, but we've used them to distance and separate ourselves. And the thing that I find is so interesting now is that in 2023, we're having these conversations where we're calling a spade, and we're saying, like, hey, look, this is the way that we built our institutions. This is the way that we function. And these are some of the harmful things that have come out of it because they were built in a time when we were very like unjust towards one another, right? If we're pointing these things out and we're calling it for what it is, I notice that there's this pushback where people say, well, why are you being so divisive? Why are
Mm,
you, we should just be focused on unity. Why are you calling all of this out? Like, you're the one who's the problem and you're being divisive. But it's like we want to skip straight to like, oh, this happened and now we're healed. But healing is really a process. And right now, I feel like collectively, as a global community, we're in this really sticky, messy middle of trying to grapple with the past and also get to a point of reconciliation, get to a point of forgiveness, get to a point of being able to see ourselves in our humanity, in our embodiment, in our bodies, but then also to see one another as fully human in our
mhm,
bodies, right? And so that's why in my book I look at these things and I look at how interconnected they are, and how I'm so grateful that there are movements like body positivity. I'm so glad that we're having these conversations. I think it's a really helpful place to start for so many people, but it cannot be enough just in and of itself. It's so great that we feel good in our bodies or even neutral in our bodies, because I know for a lot of people that is a hard fought battle just to get to that place.
mhm,
And yet at the same time, when I am in right relationship with my body, when I am no longer speaking hateful things over my body, when I am accepting all the pieces of myself, I'm in communication with my body, I'm listening to the wisdom of my body, all of these things, the embodied boundaries that my body is speaking to me, caring for my body, seeing my body as a source of wisdom, all of a sudden rehumanizing myself and my body and peeling back all of the harmful ideologies. Now it helps me see you and your body with more curiosity and compassion. It makes me see
mm,
somebody else in their body with more curiosity and compassion, because I look at the way our bodies have been racialized. I look at the way our bodies have been marginalized. I think, well, maybe there's more that's going on under the surface in that person's experience that I can't see right now. And I can get curious about that now. And that can start to be the bridge that brings us back together. If I immediately take the other path and I just say, oh, well, we're being divisive. Why are you bringing these things up? Because it's uncomfortable for me to look at. Well, I can never cross that bridge over into curiosity and actually wonder what's happening in that person's life then.
mhm, mhm. That really connects to this idea that I've had floating around in my head for a while, but
Mhm.
it kind actually really connects well with what you said before about every injustice starts with the body. And so
Mhm.
if injustice starts with the body, then justice should also start with the body.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems like the conversation about embodiment, whether
Mhm.
it's simply implied or it's made explicit, I think the conversation around embodiment should always have a political dimension to it. Like, it's not
I
just
agree with you.
enough for us to have this embodiment conversation and not
Yeah,
understand the ways that our bodies have been politicized, and therefore we should have a
absolutely.
politic regarding. And so, to me, it's not just enough for like a white person to say, "Hey, I'm embodied, and being embodied means I'm going to embrace like being white or something." Like
Mhm.
it like clearly like we think like that's not how we want the embodiment conversation to go, so clearly there's at
Yeah.
least some political dimension to
Yeah.
embodiment. And so yeah, I'm curious if you could like flesh that out a bit about like how you think we should how politics should play a
Mm.
part in, or what kind of politics should we have when we have these conversations about embodiment. So yeah, can you flesh that out a little bit, pun intended?
Yeah. So my politics comes right back down to my values and my ethics, which is always leave people better than they found them as
Mm,
best as I can, right? And this goes to everybody and everything. If even if it's like the barista in Starbucks or the cashier at my grocery store, right? Like, I want to treat everybody with dignity and respect. And so my politics is informed from that same place. And so when we again humanize people and we look at them through this common lens of embodiment, where how can we be more human? How can we be more humane? How can we humanize our bodies? How can we humanize our politics, right? Because so much of this has really been co-opted by corporations. It's been co-opted even by ideologies, right? By businesses, ideologies, all of these things. And so how do we actually get back to being human, right? For me, the body is my way forward through all of that. And
Mm.
so, yes, you're right. Like, I want people to be able to celebrate being white. Like, half of me is white, right? And so, like, should we feel shame for that part of ourselves forever? No. But also, we don't exist solely, right? Like, we all exist in connection. There's interconnectedness to all of us, right? And so,
Mm.
this is why, again, coming back into my relationship with my body must then lead in these ripples to somewhere else. It must then make me be curious of somebody else's experience in their bodies. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine recently, and we were talking about this like messy middle about racism and embodiment and all of these different things. And one of the things that she said that was really interesting, because I brought up colonization, and like, we have to talk about the history of colonization with this. Like, that's where these bodies started to begin to be politicized, especially here
Mhm.
if we live on North America, like Turtle Island. Like, we have to talk about those things. And one of the things that she said that was really interesting, because she has found her lineage goes back to Celtic roots. And she was saying, like, well, but my people were colonized like before they came and colonized everybody else here too.
Mm.
And I
Mhm.
think that those are interesting things also to remember, right? Because there can be, like, we don't want to dip over into like white supremacy or white nationalism. We don't want to dip into any of those, and we also don't want the pendulum to swing the other way as well too, because none of that would be just. None of that would be in right relationship. And so, how do we do that? I think that we really do have to look at with curiosity, what is colonization? What are the effects of colonization? How was our bodies colonized? How do we still, in our nervous system, in our ideologies, in our minds, how are we still sometimes still stuck in that place of colonization? And how do we start to decolonize and peel back these layers that have made us into these tiny little boxes that haven't given us enough space for our humanity, because they were built in a time frame that didn't care about those things. They just cared about domination, about power, and about taking over the land.
Mhm. Mhm. There there tends to be in like the colonization conversation sometimes I've
Mm,
noticed where complexity is minimized or it's
mm,
flattened. And
mm,
even for people who are racialized as white, there is this
yeah.
minimizing or flattening of their history, their identities. And
Mhm,
like for me, for example, like my grandma is a part of the Sisseton Wahpeton tribe in South Dakota, so
mhm,
she's indigenous, and
yeah,
has indigenous ancestry, and so my family has that, right? And then also
yeah,
like most of my family are Germans and Dutch, and
sure,
so like there's a complexity there, right? Of
yeah,
having this kind of interesting history of people who were colonized, my indigenous ancestors, and then also
yeah.
having ancestors who were the
Ooh,
colonizers. And
I
so there's
feel that.
complexity there.
Mhm,
And what's interesting about like some of the conversations I see happening about colonization is there tends to be like, nope, you're just white and that's what you are. And it's like, well,
yeah,
what if my history, what if my ancestry is actually more complex than that? And
totally.
actually, I think the act of colonization is to flatten and to
Everybody.
minimize the complexity that is involved with everyone. Everybody's complex in
Yes.
some way.
Yes. And this is why it's like, how do we get back to our bodies and the stories that our bodies hold? How do we get curious of all of that? How do we have more curiosity for other people's lived experiences, like you were saying? Because you can't just see it by looking at them, right? We need more space for this complexity. We need more space for the nuance. We need more space for the stories that our bodies are carrying. Right. And
Hmm.
some of that is intergenerationally. Right. And so I really appreciate what you're saying to that, because you're right. Like, colonization has flattened all of that complexity, and it's put people into little categories and little boxes. And I understand that it can sometimes be scary to start to pull the threads and poke around and question these boxes when we were raised, especially from an evangelical standpoint, at least from my experience. Like, there was like, these are the answers. Like, we read this book, and this book tells us all, this is your, like, what did we say, like basic instructions before
Before
leaving
leaving
earth or
Earth, yep.
something. Very like Bible camp now, right? Like, this, we had the book with the answers, and now all of a sudden we're questioning everything, right?
Hmm.
And that can be scary. And also at the same time, there can be so much liberation in that, because maybe we don't have to live in these tiny boxes that don't give you the space to breathe and don't give me the space to breathe either. So, like,
Hmm.
yes, there's complexity. Like, half of my history, I would say, would be very much like early colonizers. Like
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was 13, like my family celebrated like 100 years on the homestead in like Manitoba, and so it's like Canada's not that old, right? So it's like they were definitely early settlers that came over from like Scotland. And then on the other side, my family is from like they're Chinese Singaporean. My dad was born and raised in Singapore, right?
Mm.
And he immigrated over here in the 70s, but like even Singapore was colonized by the British as well, right? And so there's all of these different threads and stories that we had. And I think coming back to our bodies and noticing the way that our bodies hold trauma, our nervous systems are trying to protect us. And part of that protection is sometimes assimilation because it's not safe to grow up in the bodies that we're in, depending on the environment that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that people show up sometimes, even like when I look at like, oh, the model minority Asian, stereotype, the model minority myth, and the way that Asians have been stereotyped, like I look at that as a trauma response. Like that is
Mm.
our whole community. We have perfected the fawn response because we just have learned how to like fly under the radar. Nobody looks at us as a threat because we're all nurses and we're all pharmacists and we are like, we'd make ourselves small and we make ourselves quiet and we try not to make waves. And that is how Asians have survived in North America for so long. And
Mm.
now you're seeing, especially after, with coronavirus, such a rise in anti-Asian racism, you're starting to see a lot of Asians like speaking up and saying, hey, well, we're not one dimensional. There's a lot more to us. Like, I have anger too, but I've learned to suppress my anger because if I'm angry, then you view me as a threat. And that is
Mm-hmm.
deadly to me. Right. And so we see the way that our bodies have held on to all of this because it hasn't been safe for us to take up our
Mm-hmm.
full space. That's just one example, but there are many ways that all of us have done that at various points in our lives.
Mm-hmm. I love that you bring up that example of your experience as an Asian, with a person with Asian ancestry, because one of the like insidious pieces to
Mm,
white supremacy is as
mhm,
much as a person can conform to white supremacy, they'll never be
mhm.
white enough. And
No.
so an Asian person can conform to whiteness as much as they'd like, and
Yeah.
they can get by for maybe a while, but at some point, white supremacy by nature will
Yeah.
that person will experience white supremacy because they will
Yeah.
still not be white enough at the end of the day.
Yeah. And the insidious part of the all of this racism is sometimes we have our internalized racism as well too. Or if you're mixed race, then you have that like rejection from your own community as well too.
Mm-hmm.
From like the
Mm-hmm.
Asian community, for example, as well too. So being biracial, I've had to navigate the world in a very complex experience where I don't fully fit in one category and I don't fully fit in the other category. And now I'm grateful for it because fuck the categories. We don't need either of them and they're harming us all. But as a child and as a young person, trying to find your community and your sense of belonging and not fully being Asian enough in one category or white enough in another. Oh my gosh, it is so complex.
Mm-hmm. So complex. Later
Yeah.
on in the book, you talk about sexual embodiment, and you
Yeah.
bring up this really, really great point that I liked, where you talk about how a lot of conservative Christians often say that sexual liberation leads to a
Mm,
like free for all kind of sex.
yeah.
And you actually, though, bring up this great point where you say sexual embodiment does something very different than this like free
Yeah.
for all kind of sex,
Yeah.
way of having sex, where it's actually people are allowed and embrace the boundaries around sex,
Yes.
and they're clear about those boundaries. So it's not a
Yeah.
free for all sex; it's that people are
No.
actually clear and
Yeah.
set boundaries around
Yep.
the kind of sex that they want and have and enjoy.
Mhm.
So, can you say more about this sexual embodiment and what it means for sexual
Mhm.
liberation?
Oh, it's so important because when I am connected to my body again, when I am my primary experience of the world is in my body and I am my greatest ally is my body, I am checking in with my body regularly of like, how do I actually feel about this? How do I actually feel about that? Does this feel like something that I actually want and I'm excited for? And I'm like, oh, yes, that's the kind of sex that I want. Or is this something that I'm like, yeah, I guess I'll do it because it's an act of obligation or it feels like a duty to my partner? Or it's like, within purity culture, it was always like you save sex to your marriage, but then it felt like within marriage, it was a free for all. And you almost didn't need to check in with your partner because aren't there verses about it being like a marriage duty, right? And
Right.
so like there's so much abuse that can happen there. And there was
Hmm.
never any education on like, what do you actually want? And even with my clients, we have questions where we go even deeper. Well, what kind of sex do you want? How do you want it? Like, where do you want it? All of these different things that like it's more than just like, do you want sex? Like, check yes or no, right? But like, where are my body's embodied boundaries so that within that space I feel safe enough to actually let my walls down? If I can let my walls down, then now I can receive more, I can give more, I can play more. I'm not in my head, I'm actually in my body, and then I'm in the moment, and I can experience all the goodness that can happen there, right?
Mm.
Like that's a completely different conversation. And it's not saying, oh, it's just a free for all, like we're having sex with everybody all the time and there's no rules whatsoever. No, actually, there's a lot more communication that's
Hmm.
happening.
Hmm.
How are you feeling? Do you want this? Do you like it if I touch you there? Oh, you don't? Oh, you have triggers because of experiences that you've been through that have been really scary or painful or harmful, or boundaries that have been crossed for you in the past. Oh, I don't want you to have that experience again. So how do I listen to you to actually know you so that this can be a mutually flourishing experience for both of us? That is a completely different dialogue than
Hmm.
just like, oh, your sexual liberation just means like this like hedonistic free for all. No, it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you bring up that piece of sexual embodiment because, like I mentioned before, my first kind of gateway into deconstruction, if you will, was the
Mm,
fact that I was starting to really sense a frustration with purity culture in my
yeah.
body. And I still remember the very first time I ever had a sexual experience with someone, I was like,
Mm,
wait, like I want more of this. And I knew it in my body
mm,
immediately. Like, whatever I had been told about sex, about feeling guilty if I had sex before marriage and all
yeah.
of that, none of that was actually true in my body. Now, I still like
Yeah.
thought it in my head, but what I knew deep
Sure.
down in my body was, wait, this was an amazing experience and I want to have more of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's really interesting how, again, like how so much of my story, my own story, connects with this
Mm.
experience, this sexual embodiment, and how my whole life changed really because of it.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you had that experience. That's the kind of experiences that I hope all of us can have,
Hmm.
because our sexuality is a part of us. Even if you're asexual, it's
Hmm.
still a part of you that deserves to be seen and respected and acknowledged, not pushed under the rug, not shoved aside, not like we can't talk about it, we can't look at it, it's so taboo, it's so stigmatized. No, we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about these things in a safe, healthy way, because if not, if it's so on lockdown, then you are going to have people going into the shadows, and what they're going to find there is probably going to be really harmful,
Hmm.
probably not going to be accurate, and
Hmm.
definitely not going to be ethical, right? And so
Hmm.
how can we bring this more into the light as something that we don't have to be so afraid of? It's not dirty, it's not wrong, it's not shameful, but something that can be so liberating, so embodied, so like there can be so much care there. There can be so much exploration of like, oh my gosh, I just tapped into a new part of myself that I didn't know I had within me. Like all of that can be within sex and sexuality, but we're just so scared that we're not even asking any questions about it.
Hmm. Hmm. At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about
Mm,
bad theology and how it
yeah.
fractures our relationship with our bodies. What would you say good theology that actually heals and
Mm,
embraces our relationships with our bodies? What is that good theology? What are some of those good theological concepts or ideas that you've encountered that actually heals and liberates our
mm.
relationships with our bodies?
Yeah, I mean, within the context of Christianity, when I actually look at with curiosity the way that Jesus just lived and was very in his body, like didn't try to distance himself from his body, it seems. Like very much like of the people, of the earth, wasn't trying to be above anybody, right? Like we always talk about like, oh God, Jesus was like the man of the people, right? And like yet somehow along the line we've distanced ourselves from that. It
Mm.
seems like we've spiritualized Jesus so much for the point that we've like sanitized him of his humanity. And I think for me, one of the things that like made me um just like look at with so much like reverence and awe the just the beauty of our bodies was the fact that like Jesus lived in a womb at one point. Like
Mhm.
Jesus entered the world through a vulva at one point. Like if the body isn't good, then like God had the ability to just like drop a fully like human Jesus, fully like grown man on the earth if he wanted to with like whatever signs and wonders and miracles, but like no, like Jesus came to the earth like through the womb, through the vulva with amniotic fluid and blood and like all of the same stuff that we do, you know? And for
Mhm.
me, that was one of my first like introductions to embodiment was just marveling at the wonder of the body as I had my own three babies all at home and I was so amazed by the like I said I went in and became a birth doula after and I sat at the bedside of so many laboring people as they welcomed their families into the world and the blood sweat and tears and like you are so raw and embodied when you're giving birth. Like birth, death, and orgasm, I think are our most embodied moments because you cannot fake any of them. You
Mm.
cannot. It will not happen. And so many of my clients struggle to experience orgasm because they're so afraid of losing control of their body. They have their body on such lockdown that they can't release
Mhm.
and just allow themselves to be present in their bodies and just let go of that control, right? But that has to happen in birth, death, and orgasm. And so, like, these things have brought so much wonder into my curiosity. And the fact that, like, Jesus experienced birth in the same way that we did, that broke my brain. And that
Mhm.
brought me in down this path of pulling at these threads and just seeing everything else that I had missed because I had been taught such a sanitized way of being human.
Mhm. I know you
It is
mentioned
not
that
sanitized.
it's very much not
It's
sanitized.
very messy and so amazing.
You mentioned that during the process of writing this book, you said that you left the Christian institution, and it's interesting because I just had this video
Mm,
maybe a month or so ago that I made this YouTube video
mm,
where I talk about why I'm still a Christian. And one of those
mm.
reasons is basically what you just described. It's the incarnation. It's the idea
Yeah,
of God becoming flesh in the person of
yeah,
Jesus. And because of my interest in embodiment, it seems like there is a clear emphasis,
mm,
a clear stress within Christianity that God became a human being with a human
yeah,
body. And
yeah,
that to me should liberate us all in our bodies.
yeah. I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think that that's so beautiful, and that's the thing that, like, as much as I've walked away from the institution of Christianity, I do still find wonder in that. I'm in a
Hmm.
place right now where I'll be honest, like, I don't know, like looking at some of the historical facts, I'm like, was Jesus like a real man? Was he not? I'm like, I'm gonna put chop it up in this category of like, I'm not fully sure, but I wanna believe that like he was. And I think that there was a real person that lived and breathed and walked the earth and came from humble beginnings and probably had some really radical ideas about faith and humanity and was probably very politicized as well too, and that the institutions of the day did not like that because he was very countercultural to what was going on, and that he was politically assassinated as a result, and kind of ended up becoming a martyr and starting a movement that I don't know, an empire thought they could use to control people and
Hmm.
unify people, and so that's kind of where I'm at today. I really like his ideas though, and I'm
Hmm.
still in that camp that I still really like the ideas whether he's a myth or a mascot or a real man. I don't know, but I think that there are some valuable things that exist in his teachings that I would love to see us really look at and maybe peel back all of the stuff that we've added on to the idea of Jesus and Christianity and really get back to that because I think that he is onto something if we boil it back down to like love each other and do good and act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Like when I was still kind of very much in the Christian space and was like doing the Christian speaker circuit thing in my 20s. I mean, right there, that should tell you that I probably didn't have all of the answers, and I definitely still don't. Um, but like when I was in that space, like there was just, I don't know, there was so much more that was added onto it. And I think that if we get right back down to like, what are our relationships with one another? Where are those relationships broken? Where do we need to take responsibility for the fact that some of these relationships are broken, and try to seek healing instead of trying to be right? Like, I think that that would lead us to the answer. We're so caught up in trying to be right when our bodies are telling us that's not the way. It's not about having the answers, it's about being connected to one another. That's what we need.
Love that. Second to last question, Tara. How do you
Mhm.
hope Your Body is a Revolution inspires and liberates its readers?
Yeah, I hope it gets people curious about what stories their bodies are holding. And I really do think that if we start with that, that will bring us down into a journey that can be so revolutionary. If our bodies, every single one of us, no matter what category we've been placed in, every single one of us has a body that has been politicized. And if we start to pull those threads and get curious of the labels that have been slapped on the boxes, and the way that we forced ourselves to survive really in these boxes that are far too small for us, I think that
Hmm.
that is revolutionary. I think that that can change things. It can change things on a collective level, but it can change things in a one-to-one person level, like I said, where maybe I'm going to look at my neighbors with less judgment and more curiosity about what's actually going on the inside with them, or maybe even with the people in my family or my partners or my children. Why did they respond the way that they did? Oh, it's because their nervous system is being triggered by something that they went through that was really traumatic for them, and they don't have the words to describe it, but their body is trying to communicate. Oh my gosh, now they're not being an asshole, they're actually responding out of their triggers and their traumas. And that can give me so much more curiosity and compassion for someone. That can change things. That is profound. And I
Hmm.
hope that this book can lead us there. I hope that like, this book wasn't written to give you the answers. This was written to lead you back to your body where you can find the answers. And I tell my clients this in every single consult call that we have. Our first introduction, it's always, I'm not your teacher. Your body is your teacher. So don't put me on some pedestal. I'm not some guru. I'm not your teacher. I'm not your new pastor. That's not my job. I don't give out advice. I want to get you to be curious. I want you to facilitate the conversation with your body and let your body lead and guide you, because I really truly believe in the wisdom and intelligence of the body. And that if we just start listening to all the things that our body is trying to communicate to us, it will show us the right answers.
Hmm. Well, it reminds me of one of the things that we mentioned earlier, where
Mm,
if injustice starts with the body, then justice must start with the body as well.
yeah.
And so, absolutely, I really do think that that this reorientation, this re-relationship with our bodies, this healing, this mending of our relationship
Mm,
with our bodies is an act of revolution and is
yeah,
necessary for all of the other things, all the other kind of justice that we want to see in the world. It
absolutely.
requires that, and I think it all starts with our bodies.
And it would be incomplete without, like I said,
Hmm.
I spent 10 years. I worked on Parliament Hill. I worked with a team that amended the criminal code twice, who passed the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking, like worked with an amazing MP, MP Joy Smith, who has done really wonderful things for the anti-human trafficking movement. I'm glad for the work that was done there. But if we're not looking at the embodiment piece too, as a collective, and I see this criticism of the social justice movement sometimes, like, we can swing the pendulum the other way, and we can actually start to dehumanize people in an effort to humanize other people. And that's incomplete as well too, right? And so we really need to look at spirituality through the lens of the body. We need to remember that with our relationships with our bodies, with social justice, with all of these things that we that are good and noble and that we want to see. We want to see equality in our relationships. We want to see healing in our relationships. I want that. I hope most people want that. But to do it without looking at the lens through the lens of the body, coming back to the body first, because that was the source of our
Hmm.
division. If we don't go back to that, we're going to make the same mistakes, just in a different way.
Hmm. Absolutely. Last question, Tara. How can listeners get
Mm.
connected to you and your work, and where should they get the book?
Oh my gosh, great questions. Well, this is something I'm so excited for because I hope people get in touch. I want to connect with people. Actually, my Chinese name is Oi Kwan, and it means loves groups of people. And so I
I love
plan on
that.
doing lots of events. Like when I was writing the book, I was like, I don't want to be at my desk doing like my eighth round of revisions. I want to be in bookstores talking to people. I want to be in coffee shops hanging out with people. And so I have events that I do locally in my area, and I travel to other cities where I do community circles and sometimes women's circles and retreats. I'm also do a lot online. So I work with clients, like I mentioned, one-on-one online. But I also have these beautiful pockets of community on social media, and sometimes we do in virtual events where we'll do things like embodied movement meditation, which I talk about in one of the chapters. We do that, and we meet on Zoom, and it's just such a beautiful, just unifying thing. Even though we're all in our little squares all across the world, sometimes it's so beautiful to see how we can like share a same experience somewhere. So people could find me there online across all of the social networks at Miss Tara Teng. My website is tarateng.com. All of my different offerings are on there. And then I'm going on tour, so I'll be
Hey.
hitting up different cities and doing all kinds of different events. Would love to meet people and talk about the book. The book is available in Barnes and Noble, in indie bookstores, on Amazon.com, Amazon.ca. So go get a copy. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear if it resonates with you, if it made you think of something. Maybe even tell me if you really hated it. That's fine too. I can take it. But yeah, I would love to see what it brings up for you in your body. And hopefully, when you read the book, it's an embodied experience as well. There's reflection questions at the end of every chapter.
Hmm.
There's also an embodiment prompt invitation exercise if you wanted to take it one step further and hopefully experience and really start to like digest and integrate, reflect on the things that each chapter talks about. I want it to be something that becomes very much an experience and not just something where we're consuming information, but can we experience it, because that moves us from logical head knowledge into deep embodied experience knowledge.
Hmm. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, I love the book, Tara. It was
I'm so
incredible.
glad.
It was one of my favorites. Obviously, as somebody who's really interested in the whole embodiment conversation
Totally.
and movement right now, this was just incredible. And so it's just another one of
Yeah.
those books I need to add to my collection of
I'm
embodiment type of
glad.
books. So thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for chatting a little bit more about it.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.